There is a type of silence that precedes certain types of attack, and the soldiers who served in the forts of the 19th century Texas frontier learned to recognize it with genuine terror. It was not the usual silence of night on the plains. It was something more specific, more loaded. Preserved military records repeatedly describe this phenomenon, the way the wind stopped, how domestic animals became restless for no apparent reason, and how the nighttime temperature remained abnormally high even after sunset. Experienced soldiers knew what this meant. The moon was full, or close to it, and it was summer. This specific combination, which Texan settlers called the Comanche moon, had become synonymous with a very particular type of nightmare. There is a specific fort whose exact location remains the subject of debate among historians due to the fragmentation of available records, which researchers identify as an extreme example of this phenomenon. An isolated military post with a reduced garrison that faced a prolonged siege during exactly this kind of summer night. But what made this particular siege so different, according to surviving accounts, was not just the attack itself. This is what happened later when the soldiers realized that the real enemy was not the warriors outside the walls. It was the water that was running out inside them. The question this investigation aims to explore is how an American military post, supposedly protected by walls, superior weaponry, and the entire logistical structure of the United States Army, was almost destroyed not by direct military force, but by something as basic as the lack of drinkable liquid. And what does this reveal about the deep structural flaws that existed throughout the Texas border fortification system during that particular period? To understand how such a situation could happen, it is first necessary to understand the specific nature of the forts that the United States built along the Texas border during the period of expansion and conflict with the Comanches. These military posts, according to detailed historical analyses of frontier military architecture, were often built with limited resources, in locations chosen more for broad strategic considerations than for careful assessment of available local water resources. Researchers who study the military logistics of this period point out that many forts depended on water sources external to the fortified structures themselves, nearby streams, wells that needed to be dug separately, or cisterns that stored rainwater but had limited capacity to sustain a significant population for a prolonged period. This dependence on external sources represented structural vulnerabilities that many military planners of the time, according to later historical analyses, simply had not adequately considered when designing and positioning these outposts. West Texas, specifically, has climatic and geological characteristics that make this vulnerability particularly dangerous. The semi-arid plains of this region suffer from chronic water scarcity, with surface water sources often seasonal or completely absent during the hottest summer months. The Comanches, by contrast, possessed, according to previous investigations in this series into their military tactics, extraordinarily detailed territorial knowledge about exactly where water existed and where it disappeared as the seasons progressed. This asymmetry of knowledge about local water resources created, according to contemporary military researchers, a strategic advantage that went far beyond any consideration about weapons or the number of combatants involved in any specific confrontation. And it was exactly this advantage that would become devastatingly relevant during the siege this investigation examines. Records about specific sieges of forts on the Texas border during the period of greatest intensity of the Comanche conflict are preserved in fragmentary form, according to historians who work with military archives from that period. Unlike open field battles, which often generated detailed reports due to their dramatic character and the significant casualties they produced, prolonged sieges of isolated posts sometimes received less extensive documentation, especially when the garrison involved was small and when the post in question did not have strategic significance, broad enough to attract the attention of more distant higher commands. This particular documentary gap, according to researchers who study this period, means that many details about specific sieges need to be reconstructed through fragmentary sources. Personal letters from soldiers, administrative reports, partial narratives, and occasionally oral accounts preserved through families of veterans who later settled in the region. What these fragments reveal, when carefully pieced together by historians, is a pattern that repeated itself with disturbing frequency along the Texas frontier. Small garrisons, often consisting of fewer than 30 soldiers, positioned at posts with limited supplies, facing sieges that could last for days without any realistic possibility of immediate reinforcement. The specific combination of a prolonged siege during a period of extreme summer heat, exactly when conditions on the Comanche moon made attacks more likely and more effective, created a scenario where the very physical survival of the garrison, regardless of any consideration of the military outcome of the confrontation itself, became a genuinely uncertain matter. Some researchers identify this pattern as one of the least discussed but most revealing aspects of the true nature of warfare on the Texas frontier. Not just dramatic confrontations between opposing forces, But situations of extreme survival, where basic environmental factors could determine outcome as decisively as any specific military tactic. There is one specific account, preserved through military correspondence and later analyzed by historians studying this period of the Texas frontier, that describes in disturbing detail what happened when a military post faced a prolonged siege without adequate access to water. The first signs of trouble, according to these records, were often undramatic. Soldiers simply noticed that water reserves, calculated for a specific period of normal operation, were being consumed more quickly than planned, as the extreme heat of the Texas summer drastically increased the individual hydration needs of each man in the garrison. As the siege dragged on, and as the ability to access outside water sources became increasingly dangerous due to the constant presence of Comanche warriors keeping watch over the fort's perimeter, the situation evolved from inconvenient to genuinely critical. Researchers studying dehydration physiology in extreme heat conditions point out that in temperatures that regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius on the Texas plains during the summer, individuals without adequate access to water could experience significant physical deterioration in a surprisingly short period of time, often less than 48 hours before physical capacity and even cognitive capacity began to be seriously compromised. For a military garrison, this deterioration did not just represent individual suffering. It represented a direct and progressive compromise of the fort's own defense capacity, as dehydrated soldiers progressively lost the ability to maintain adequate vigilance, to operate weapons with the necessary precision, and to respond effectively to any additional attempted attack that the Comanches could carry out, realizing this growing vulnerability. What few accounts of the time openly admitted, according to more recent historical analyses, was the genuine possibility that certain prolonged sieges could have resulted not in military defeat through direct combat, but through the gradual physical collapse of the entire garrison, incapacitated by dehydration before any final attack was necessary to determine the outcome of the confrontation. The question of exactly how the Comanches exploited this specific water-related vulnerability deserves further exploration, as it reveals a dimension of Comanche military strategy that goes beyond what conventional, purely tactical analyses often capture. Military researchers who study siege tactics used by plains peoples point out that the Comanches demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how simply isolating a fortified post from its external water sources, without the need for a direct assault on the fort's own walls, represented an effective strategy and significantly less costly in terms of its own casualties than direct confrontation against fortified defensive positions. This siege strategy, based on deprivation rather than direct assault, according to comparative historical analyses, aligns with a broader pattern of Comanche tactical sophistication already examined in previous investigations in this series into their military methods, a consistent preference for strategies that maximize damage to the adversary while minimizing risk to the warriors themselves. Comanche warriors, positioned on high ground or in vegetation that offered adequate cover around the perimeter of a besieged fort, could effectively thwart any attempts by soldiers to break out of the compound. S-walls, to obtain water from nearby sources without the need for direct exposure to the defensive fire that any frontal assault on the fortified structures themselves would inevitably provoke. This approach, maintained for a sufficient period of time, turned time itself into a weapon against the besieged garrison, creating a situation where simply waiting, maintaining effective isolation, could eventually force surrender or collapse of defensive capacity without the need for any direct military confrontation, which was more risky for the attackers themselves. The true meaning behind this specific strategy is that it reveals tactical understanding that went far beyond simple impulsive aggression or the pursuit of direct, dramatic confrontation. It was cold and deliberate military calculation, based on precise assessment of specific structural vulnerabilities that American military posts in the region genuinely possessed. And it is exactly this type of strategic calculation that appears to have characterized the specific siege that this investigation is exploring. The available records about this specific siege, although fragmentary as previously mentioned, suggest that the garrison involved recognized the severity of their water situation relatively quickly after the start of isolation. Preserved letters from soldiers who survived this period, or similar periods at other frontier outposts facing comparable circumstances, describe what researchers identify as a specific psychological pattern of increasing anxiety as water reserves visibly dwindled, creating what historians of military psychology describe as a particular form of terror that combined fear of direct attack with additional and simultaneous fear of death from the much slower and much more agonizing cause represented by severe dehydration. Some specific reports mention desperate attempts at extreme rationing of available water, with officers responsible for the garrison implementing strict controls on individual consumption that, although necessary to extend the duration of available reserves, created significant additional tension within the group of soldiers themselves, as disputes over the fair allocation of such a critically scarce resource inevitably emerged in situations of extreme and prolonged deprivation. Researchers who study group dynamics in extreme survival situations point out that this type of internal tension, added to the already significant stress posed by the constant external threat of the Comanche siege, created an extraordinarily challenging psychological environment that tested not only the physical endurance of the soldiers involved, but also their ability to maintain cohesion and basic military discipline under circumstances of deprivation that significantly exceeded any conventional training they might have received for more direct, more conventional combat situations. From this point on, available accounts suggest that the situation would evolve into an even more critical phase, where desperate decisions about how to attempt to obtain additional water, even under extreme risk of exposure to Comanche fire, would begin to be seriously considered by the leadership of the besieged fort itself. And it is precisely at this point that the story becomes even more disturbing. There are specific accounts, preserved through later testimony from survivors of similar sieges along the Texas border, that describe desperate attempts by small groups of volunteers leaving the fort walls at night, seeking to reach nearby water sources under cover of darkness, even at considerable risk of detection by Comanche warriors keeping constant watch over the perimeter. These operations, according to later military analyses that examined tactics developed in extreme siege situations, represented calculated gambles where commanders needed to balance the immediate risk of losing additional soldiers against the certain and progressive risk of complete collapse of the entire garrison through continued dehydration if no action was taken. Some researchers studying this specific type of nighttime operation point out that the Comanche moon itself, which had originally created favorable conditions for the initial attack that resulted in the siege, could paradoxically also, in certain specific circumstances, create additional difficulties for these attempts to fetch water, as the intense illumination of the summer full moon made stealthy movement significantly more risky and more easily detectable by Comanche observers strategically positioned around the fort. This specific irony, where the same lunar condition that had made the initial attack so effective also compromised the beleaguered garrison's ability to seek desperate solutions to its growing water crisis, represents, according to historians who examine this phenomenon more broadly, it is a particularly vivid example of how seemingly simple environmental factors could have extraordinarily significant cascading consequences on the outcome of entire military confrontations in that specific context of the Texas border war. Preserved accounts suggest that, in at least some documented cases of similar sieges, these groups of volunteers were able, through a combination of luck, limited but real knowledge of local terrain, and carefully calculated timing in relation to specific moments of apparent less Comanche vigilance, to return with limited but crucial quantities of additional water that allowed them to extend the garrison's survivability for an additional period, even if insufficient to fully resolve the broader crisis they continued to face. There is also a specific dimension related to how animals within the fort itself, military horses and eventually pack mules, were affected by the same critical water shortage, creating an additional logistical complication that military researchers consider often underestimated in conventional analyses of this type of siege. Horses, according to historical veterinary analyses applied to this specific context, require significantly greater amounts of daily water than humans to maintain adequate physiological function, creating additional and simultaneous pressure on already critically limited reserves that needed, in some way, to be divided between human needs and the needs of these essential animals for any future capacity for rapid movement or communication with other nearby military posts. Some preserved accounts suggest that, in situations of extreme water crisis, painful decisions needed to be made about prioritizing between human consumption and animal consumption, with some garrisons opting to sacrifice part of their own horses, not only to reduce total demand on available water reserves, but also, in cases of more extreme desperation, to obtain residual body fluid that could, although repugnant and far from ideal, offer some limited form of additional hydration to soldiers in a state of severe deprivation. This particularly grim dimension of what prolonged sieges under extreme water scarcity might eventually require, according to historians who document these lesser-known aspects of frontier warfare, rarely appears in more conventional and more romanticized historical narratives about conflicts between American soldiers and Plains Indian warriors, which often prefer to emphasize more dramatic aspects of direct combat rather than reveal the more visceral and more desperate reality of basic survival that situations like this genuinely represented for the men directly involved. What these accounts reveal, in their uncomfortable rawness, is a dimension of the frontier war that goes far beyond any conventional heroic narrative, presenting instead a much rawer and much more human portrait of what real people were forced to consider and even do when faced with deprivation extreme enough to threaten immediate basic survival. There is also a specific question about how commanders of nearby posts, when they eventually received news or a signal about a siege in progress, assessed and decided on the possibility of sending reinforcements or aid to garrisons in a critical situation. Researchers studying military logistics on the Texas frontier point out that significant distances between different military outposts, combined with communication limitations that relied primarily on horse messengers covering these distances, in conditions that were often dangerous due to the widespread Comanche presence throughout the region, created a situation where even when relief was genuinely desired and planned, the time required to mobilize and deploy adequate rescue forces often significantly exceeded the period of time that a beleaguered and waterless garrison could reasonably expect to survive under suitable conditions for the full benefit of that late help. This temporal gap between urgent need and available military response capacity represents, according to broader historical analyses of the effectiveness of the Texas border fortification system, a systemic structural failure that went far beyond any specific failure of command or individual planning, instead reflecting genuine and profound limitations in the entire military infrastructure available to the United States in that specific region during that particular historical period. Some military historians argue that this broader structural limitation, examined through the specific case that investigation is exploring, helps explain why the Comanche strategy of prolonged siege based on water isolation rather than direct confrontation represented a genuinely rational and genuinely effective tactical choice, as it exploited not only the immediate physical vulnerability of any specific garrison under siege, but also broader systemic vulnerability related to the general inability of the American military system to provide sufficient rapid response to crisis situations developing at isolated posts across vast and geographically challenging territory. What few conventional historians adequately emphasize, according to this more systemic analysis, is that each individual successful siege, even when it did not directly result in the complete destruction of a specific garrison, cumulatively contributed to a broader demonstration of the genuine limitations of the American border defense system, information that experienced Comanche commanders were likely to incorporate into future tactical planning for similar operations against other vulnerable outposts identified across the entire length of the Texas border during this prolonged period of conflict. There is an additional aspect of this investigation that deserves specific attention: how these prolonged sieges specifically affected the mental health of the soldiers involved, creating what contemporary researchers would identify as significant symptoms of what today would be recognized as severe psychological trauma related to prolonged combat. Preserved letters and diaries from soldiers who survived this type of experience describe, according to analyses by historians who have examined these documents with attention to psychological details, patterns of extreme anxiety, difficulty sleeping even after the immediate crisis was resolved, and what some researchers describe as persistent hypervigilance that continued to affect these men long after they had left active military service on the frontier. Historical military psychology researchers point out that the specific combination of constant external threat posed by visible Comanche surveillance around the perimeter, combined with simultaneous internal threat posed by the progressive physical deterioration caused by dehydration itself, created a particular and especially intense form of psychological stress that significantly exceeded what conventional military training of the time prepared soldiers to adequately cope with. Unlike conventional battle, where outcome was often determined in a relatively short period of intense time, prolonged sieges under water scarcity created the experience of extended terror, where each additional hour of survival brought both temporary relief and simultaneous recognition that the fundamental crisis remained genuinely unresolved and potentially increasingly desperate. This specific psychological dimension, according to historians who study the subjective experience of Texas frontier soldiers, often remains invisible in conventional historical analyses that tend to focus primarily on objective tactical and strategic outcomes, thus missing a fuller understanding of the genuine human cost that this specific type of prolonged combat posed for the individuals directly involved in these extreme survival situations. There is also a specific issue related to how the presence of civilians, in some documented cases where border posts included not only soldiers, but also families or settlers who had sought protection within the walls during periods of heightened Comanche threat, further complicated the already challenging equation of survival during prolonged sieges under water scarcity. Researchers examining records on the population composition of certain border posts during periods of intensified conflict point out that the presence of women and children, in addition to the soldiers themselves, created additional demographic pressure on already critically limited resources, while also introducing additional moral and practical considerations about how rationing should be conducted fairly between the vulnerable civilian population and the military force responsible for their direct protection. Some preserved accounts suggest that in certain documented sieges, explicit priority was given to children and women when it came to the allocation of available water reserves, even if this meant a further and potentially dangerous reduction in the rations available to the very soldiers responsible for maintaining the fort's defensive capacity through a period of prolonged crisis. This specific dimension reveals, according to historians who study historical military ethics applied to contexts of extreme survival, additional moral complexity that sieges involving civilian populations mix action with military force genuinely represented, requiring difficult decisions about prioritization that went far beyond simple tactical calculation about how best to defend a fortified position against a specific external threat. The presence of these families, according to some researchers, may also have influenced decisions about acceptable risk in relation to the desperate operations to search for additional water mentioned above, since the motivation to protect not only one's own life, but also the lives of vulnerable civilians under direct protection, possibly increased the willingness of volunteer soldiers to accept high personal risk in attempts to alleviate a water crisis that threatened the collective survival of everyone within the walls of the besieged fort. There is also a specific dimension related to how the American military itself, in subsequent analyses and in internal correspondence preserved in military archives, processed and evaluated this specific type of incident, revealing what researchers consider important institutional recognition, although often limited in its subsequent practical application, about the need for significant improvements in logistical planning related specifically to water resources for Texas border posts. Preserved internal reports, according to historians who examined these lesser-known administrative documents, occasionally recommended revisions to construction and positioning protocols for future military outposts, emphasizing the need to ensure more reliable and protected access to water sources, including possible investment in digging wells internal to the fortified structures themselves, rather than relying exclusively on external sources that effective Comanche sieges could isolate with relative ease. Researchers studying practical implementation of these recommendations point out, however, that significant budget constraints, combined with broader military priorities that often competed for limited resources available to the entire system of frontier fortifications, meant that many of these recommended improvements were implemented partially, slowly, or in some documented cases, were never genuinely implemented before specific posts were eventually abandoned or reconfigured through broader changes in American military strategy as the conflict with the Comanches evolved over subsequent decades. This gap between institutional recognition of a genuine problem and effective practical implementation of a corresponding solution represents, according to military historians who study this broader pattern, a further example of the systemic limitation that characterized much of the American military response to the specific challenges posed by the Texas Frontier War, suggesting that structural vulnerabilities like that, exploited so effectively through Comanche siege tactics based on water isolation, likely remained, to a greater or lesser extent, persistent features of many border posts through a prolonged period of continued conflict. The question of how certain specific sieges, including the one this investigation is examining in depth, eventually ended, whether through Comanche withdrawal for reasons of their own that Native commanders considered strategically appropriate, or through the eventual arrival of military reinforcements, or, in more tragic cases, through complete collapse of the defensive capacity of the beleaguered garrison, deserves additional careful consideration before we move on to examine broader and longer-lasting consequences of this specific type of extreme military experience. Researchers studying Comanche siege completion patterns point out that Plains warriors often did not necessarily seek complete annihilation of a beleaguered garrison as a primary military objective, but instead valued demonstration of military and psychological capability that could discourage future expansion of American settlement, along with possible acquisition of valuable material resources, such as horses or supplies, without needing to assume the significant additional risk that a direct final assault on a still defended position would pose for the Comanche attackers themselves. This means that in several documented cases of prolonged sieges under severe water shortages, eventual Comanche withdrawal, motivated by their own assessment of when specific strategic objectives had been sufficiently achieved, or possibly by practical necessity to move on to other tactical or subsistence priorities related to their own broader patterns of nomadic life on the plains, represented a more common conclusion of this type of confrontation than any more dramatic and more definitive in any specific direction. This more common and less dramatic reality, according to historians who seek a more precise understanding of real patterns of conflict on the Texas frontier, contrasts with more simplified and more sensationalized narratives that often dominate popular representations of this historical period, suggesting that many sieges ended not through a dramatic and decisive climax, but through a more gradual and more ambiguous process of Comanche withdrawal that left surviving garrison, albeit severely traumatized and physically weakened by the experience of extreme deprivation they had just endured, but technically victorious, in the limited sense of simply having survived until the moment when the immediate external threat finally dissipated through the Comanche decision to move on to other priorities. But even this limited victory, as the next part of this investigation will explore in more specific detail, was often accompanied by lasting physical and psychological costs that would extend far beyond the immediate moment of relief when the siege finally ended and when access to adequate water could finally be restored to the extremely debilitated survivors of this truly extreme experience of survival under conditions that tested the most fundamental limits of human physical and psychological endurance. But even this limited victory was often accompanied by lasting physical and psychological costs that would extend far beyond the immediate moment of relief when the siege finally ended. Researchers who study the medical consequences of prolonged severe dehydration point out that soldiers who survived this type of experience often carried physical injuries that did not go away simply because access to adequate water had finally been restored. Compromised kidney function, cardiovascular problems related to prolonged extreme stress, and subtle but significant neurological damage related to extended periods of severe dehydration represented, according to historical medical analyses applied retrospectively to this type of situation, consequences that could persist for years or even throughout the subsequent lives of these specific survivors. Preserved military medical records, although limited in their diagnostic sophistication by medical standards of the time, occasionally mention soldiers who, after returning from duty on the Texas frontier, presented with what contemporary doctors vaguely described as impaired constitutions or permanently compromised health, without necessarily explicitly connecting these health problems to specific episodes of extreme deprivation that these men had experienced during prolonged sieges like the one this investigation has examined. This gap in historical medical diagnosis, according to contemporary researchers who revisit these cases through more advanced medical knowledge currently available, suggests that the true scale of the lasting physical damage caused by these episodes of extreme survival likely remains underestimated in the conventional historical records available, as causal connections between the specific experience of severe dehydration and subsequent health problems were rarely explicitly documented or adequately understood by the limited medical standards of that particular historical period. There is also a specific dimension related to how these survivors processed and shared, or often did not share, their experiences with family and broader communities after returning from military service on the border. Historians who study military culture and combat memory from this period point to a consistent pattern where many veterans demonstrated significant reluctance to discuss specific details about the more traumatic experiences they had endured, including prolonged sieges under extreme deprivation, preferring instead to maintain relative silence about these more disturbing aspects of their military service, even when willing to share more conventional accounts of other aspects of their frontier experience. This specific reluctance, according to historical psychology, researchers who study trauma processing patterns in different historical periods may reflect both cultural limitations of the time regarding the open expression of male emotional vulnerability and implicit recognition on the part of these veterans themselves of the genuine difficulty of communicating adequately for those who had not experienced similar experience, true intensity and true specific horror that situations, such as extreme water deprivation under constant threat of attack, genuinely represented. Some historians, who managed to locate and analyze more detailed personal diaries, preserved by descendants of specific veterans who served at Texas frontier posts during a period of intense conflict with the Comanches, describe entries that suggest continued and prolonged psychological processing of these experiences through subsequent decades, with some veterans mentioning, even years later, recurring dreams related specifically to extreme thirst or to intense sensory memories related to that specific period of deprivation they had experienced. This fragmentary but revealing evidence suggests that although the medical and cultural system of the time did not possess adequate vocabulary or conceptual framework to adequately name and treat what we would now recognize as significant combat-related psychological trauma, these soldiers' genuine subjective experience often involved long-lasting psychological distress that persisted well beyond any immediate military resolution of the specific encounter they had survived. There is also a specific question regarding how this type of extreme experience, when it eventually became known through accounts shared between soldiers or through broader military correspondence, influenced morale and behavior of other garrisons stationed at similar posts across the Texas border. Researchers who study collective military psychology point out that knowledge about particularly severe previous sieges, especially those involving critical water crises, like the one this investigation examines, likely contributed to what contemporary psychologists would describe as significant anticipatory anxiety among soldiers deployed to other similarly vulnerable and similarly isolated posts across the extensive Texas border. This anticipatory anxiety, according to this analysis, may have influenced practical decisions made by other garrisons about how best to prepare for a similar possibility, including possibly greater attention to establishing more substantial water reserves when resources and time permitted such preparations, or greater specific surveillance aimed at identifying early signs of conditions associated with the Comanche moon that could indicate heightened risk of imminent attack. Some military historians suggest that this type of distributed learning, transmitted informally between different garrisons, through military communication, and through personnel transfers between different posts, represented an important but often underappreciated form of tactical adaptation that occurred organically within the American military system itself, complementing, and in some cases perhaps even replacing, any broader formal and institutional reforms that higher commands in Washington might or might not eventually implement in response to reports about specific incidents like the one examined in this investigation. This capacity for informal tactical adaptation, although certainly less systematic and less comprehensive than coordinated institutional reform might theoretically have provided, suggests that even within the significant structural constraints already examined earlier in this investigation, individual soldiers and specific local commanders were likely developing, through direct experience and through informally shared knowledge, increasingly sophisticated understanding of how best to navigate specific risks posed by this particular type of Comanche tactical threat over a prolonged period of continued conflict. To fully understand the broader significance of this specific type of military experience within the overall history of U.S. Comanche conflict, it is necessary also to consider how it connects with more extensive patterns already examined in previous investigations in this series into Comanche tactics themselves and broader Comanche strategic sophistication. The demonstrated ability to effectively exploit specific water vulnerabilities of fixed military posts, as this investigation has examined in detail, connects directly with extraordinary territorial knowledge already discussed in previous investigations into how the Comanches understood and strategically utilized natural resources of the plains, including specific seasonal patterns of water availability that inform both their own movement and subsistence strategies, and their ability to identify and exploit corresponding vulnerabilities in adversaries less familiar with these same complex environmental realities. This broader connection suggests that sieges based on water isolation, rather than representing an isolated and specific tactic used occasionally, probably reflected a more systematic and consistent application of P, more general strategic principle that the Comanches had developed through generations of accumulated military experience, adapting this general principle to specific circumstances presented by different types of adversaries and by different specific geographic contexts that they encountered throughout the territorial extent of Comancheria and its adjacent regions. Researchers seeking more systematic understanding of Comanche military doctrine, recognizing the inherent limitations of attempting to reconstruct systems of strategic thought that have not been documented through direct Comanche written sources, suggest that the pattern revealed through specific cases like the one examined in this investigation points to broader and more consistently applied tactical sophistication than more superficial or more conventional analyses of Texas frontier conflict often recognize or adequately document. There's also a final dimension that deserves careful consideration in this thorough investigation: how contemporary historians evaluate the broader significance of this specific type of episode within more general debates about how we should understand and narrate American frontier military history in a more balanced and historically accurate way. More conventional historical narratives about conflict between the United States and Comanches, especially those produced and popularized through American popular culture throughout the 20th century, often emphasize dramatic military confrontations and specific battles with clear and definitive outcomes, creating an overall impression of frontier warfare that privileged moments of intense action and satisfying narrative resolution over the more complex, more ambiguous, and often slower and more desperately mundane reality of basic survival under extreme conditions that this specific investigation has examined in depth. Contemporary historians, specializing in a more critical and more nuanced review of this history, point out that cases like the specific siege examined in this investigation, although less dramatic in terms of conventional narrative than better known and more extensively documented battles, offer perhaps a more revealing and historically significant perspective on the true everyday nature and genuine human cost that protracted conflict on the Texas frontier represented both for American soldiers and, of course, for the indigenous peoples themselves involved in this broader and more complex historical confrontation. This more balanced historiographical approach, which seeks to complement and which seeks to contextualize more dramatic and more conventional narratives with careful attention to less glamorous but equally significant experiences, such as that explored throughout this comprehensive investigation into extreme water crisis during prolonged siege, represents, according to researchers who defend this more comprehensive methodology, an important contribution to a more complete and more genuinely representative historical understanding of the real complexity of conflict that shaped, in profound and lasting ways, both American history and indigenous history through this crucial and transformative period in the territorial and cultural history of Texas and of the North American plains more broadly. There is yet another aspect that contemporary researchers consider relevant to this broader investigation: how these specific episodes of extreme water crisis connect with more general historical debates about colonial American infrastructure and about how this infrastructure often reflected priorities that privileged rapid territorial expansion over careful planning and adequate investment in long-term sustainability for the very posts this expansion required. Historians of colonial infrastructure point out that the pattern revealed through the specific case examined in this investigation, hasty. Construction of forts with insufficient attention to reliable water resources reflected a broader pattern observable in multiple contexts of American territorial expansion through the 19th century, where political and military pressure to establish a rapid presence in contested territory often trumped more careful considerations about the long-term practical sustainability of those same facilities. This prioritization of speed of expansion over quality of planning, according to this broader analysis, was not unique to the specific context of the Texas frontier, but represented a more systemic feature of how American territorial expansion generally operated during this historical period, suggesting that specific vulnerabilities exploited so effectively by the Comanches through water siege tactics likely also existed, to varying degrees, in or other contexts of American border expansion across different regions of the continent during a similar historical period. Recognizing this more systemic pattern, according to researchers who advocate this broader perspective, helps to contextualize specific episodes like the one examined in this investigation, not as isolated and anomalous failures of specific military planning, but as particular manifestations of broader and more persistent structural tension between American expansionist territorial ambition and the actual practical capacity to adequately sustain that expansion through infrastructure genuinely suited to the specific environmental and strategic challenges that each particular region presented. The final question this investigation leaves for broader reflection is how many other similar episodes, equally significant in terms of genuine human cost, but less documented and less dramatically narrated than more conventional military confrontations, remain today practically forgotten within fragmentary historical archives, awaiting more careful historiographical attention that might eventually recover and adequately share these stories of extreme survival. Stories that reveal, perhaps more effectively than any better-known dramatic battle, the true visceral reality and genuine human cost that protracted war on the American frontier had for all those directly involved in this complex and often devastating chapter in the territorial history of the Americas. The walls of these forts still exist in some cases as preserved ruins that tourists visit without necessarily fully understanding what happened within them during specific moments of extreme crisis that conventional history often fails to adequately convey through standardized information plaques or through more superficial historical narratives. And the Comanche moon, that particular astronomical and climatic phenomenon already examined extensively in a previous investigation in this series, continues to rise every summer over the same plains of West Texas, heedless of the specific human history it helped shape through decades of conflict that it made possible through its particular combination of light, heat, and conditions that favored both Comanche attack and, as this thorough investigation has demonstrated, corresponding American vulnerability that few mainstream historians have examined closely enough until more recent and more careful analyses like the one this investigation represented. Sources and reference works for further study. Historical records from the Texas State Library and Archives Commission relating to military posts on the Texas border, documentation preserved in the National Archives relating to military correspondence about frontier operations during the period of Comanche conflict, The Comanche Empire by Pekka Hemelainen, research on dehydration physiology applied retrospectively to historical contexts of prolonged combat. Historical military psychology analyses of combat trauma in periods prior to the formal recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder. Archaeological and historical documentation on the architecture and logistical planning of military fortifications in West Texas during the 19th century.